everybody, again on the second episode of Biblical Hebrew, another introductory class. We're not today, still not going to look at the language itself, but we talk around the language a bit. But some examples. The topic of today is, what exactly is Biblical Hebrew? Because there's different types of Hebrew. You might think, if I learn all the letters and all the words, then I know Hebrew. Then I can read the Bible. I can understand the prayers. I can go to Israel and talk. Is biblical Hebrew the same as, let's say, modern Hebrew, the language that's spoken in Israel? Spoiler alert, it really isn't. Because just think, languages constantly evolve, right? It's not that one language is the same over the centuries, and languages change, although it goes so gradually that you don't necessarily notice it sometimes. But if you would interview, let's say in America, in Europe, older people, and you would really carefully study the words that they use, and you go to young people, you would see that there's words that they use that the older people doesn't use or hardly uses. I'm just going to give you an example in English. If we go back, let's say, what is it? 600 years ago, right? That's the difference between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew is somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. So some people even, and some texts might even be older than that. So, the Exodus is generally estimated to be like over 3,300 years ago. So that period from then to now, if there's any, that is a long period of time. So 600 years is actually hardly anything if you compare it to Hebrew. But go back 600 years in the history of the English language. Now here we have an image, I don't know if it's based on reality, probably not, of Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer is one of the first, known authors of English. And his book is called Canterbury Tales, let's say 330 years ago, roughly. If we read the story, you would see that it's quite different from how do we speak now. The story of Alexander is so commune that every wight that hath discretion hath heard somewhat of all his fortune. This wide world, as in conclusion, he won by strength, or for his high renown, they were glad for peace unto him send. The pride of man and beast he laid down, whereso he came unto the world's end. Now, it sounds better than that. It looks harder when I pronounce it. It's easier. So it's partially the spelling that has changed. But in modern English, this would be the history of Alexander is so commonly known that every person who has good judgment has heard something of all his fortune. This wide world, in the end, he won by strength, or for his high renown, they were glad to offer him peace. The pride of man and beast he brought low, wherever he came, unto the world's end. It's a bit different, right? 600 years ago. Do we go back just another few hundred years back? This is, we're not 100% sure, at least 1,000 years old, but maybe even 100 years old, which is still a lot less if you compare modern Hebrew, the time difference between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew. But this is Old English. There was herpen swag, swoeten sengskoops, sag de sethe koothe, roemskaft vier, Fioran rekkan, kvad that se almehtiga, orden worte. And that means there was the sway of the harp, sweetly sang the poet. He, able to relate it, told about the creation of men of long ago. He said that the Almighty made the earth. So it's a big difference. If you have time, you can compare, and then you would recognize a few words in there: Almighty, El Mehdiga, etc., etc. But that instead of said, and some other words. Swag is the sway, right? Okay, and Eordan, earth. Okay, there are some, but it is definitely, and I probably pronounce it even more modern. I'm not 100% sure how it was really pronounced in those days, but if somebody would speak fast, it's very unlikely that somebody from modern speaker of English would understand the English from 1,000 or 1,300 years ago. So similar you could expect from Hebrew. It is actually there are differences that makes it's clear now. It would be a miracle, and in this case, the miracle is lacking. It would be a miracle. It would be unnatural for a language to stay the same, if only because new words are introduced. Right? The Torah doesn't have a word for electricity or microwave or stovetop oven and stuff like that. Just give a few trivial examples. So, of course, the language has to change, and it's if there is a miracle here, the miracle is, or at least that's a surprising fact, is that Hebrew changed almost so little that you can still understand a lot if you and after more than 2,000 years, let's say 3,000 years, that words are still somewhat understandable. Now we'll look at the next picture. Hebrew. So we have biblical Hebrew, and this is the topic of today. Um, but there's also rabbinic Hebrew, which is sometimes called Mishnaic Hebrew. So if I'm a rabbi and I speak Hebrew, that's not called rabbinical Hebrew. Rabbinic Hebrew is really Hebrew from the time of the Talmud, so Mishnah from the Mishnah and that period. Then we have a third kind of Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, and I will talk about rabbinic and medieval in our next class. And finally, modern Hebrew, also we'll talk about that a little bit. And so there's four stages here of Hebrew, and every stage you can see differences. But I want to focus today on biblical Hebrew, because biblical Hebrew is not so simple itself. Even the books of the Bible have been written over many centuries. So some books are much older than others. Some books are much later. They're also written in different locations, in the north and in the south. Some have actually been written in Babylonia, and by different people from different backgrounds, different social status. Like there, we have a book of Amos, which is written by the prophet Amos, a shepherd. But there is others that were like in from royal families or close to royal families, or the priests, which were like somewhat of an elite group. Those are also, let's even if you go on the street and you talk to simple people, and I don't mean that derogatory at all, but people with maybe less of education, or in a minority group, or in rural areas with farmers, they might speak use different language than people from who are professors or politicians or business people. Everybody has their own lingo, their own words that they use, and that was also the case in Hebrew. So we have to look even in biblical Hebrew. Now you could say, um, but the Hebrew is the word of God. God doesn't come from different social backgrounds. He's not from different locations. He's in heaven. So there's only one location, right? But there is a principle that the Torah and I like to take that in a bigger, that God speaks to humans in the language of people, meaning He speaks in the person's language. If there's a message that the Torah or that the prophets uh, that the prophets receive from God, it always comes out in the language of the person of the prophet, right? So in order to understand the message, it helps to know actually the language of the person. Otherwise, let's say if I say, if I would call my home an apartment, and someone else calls it a house or a mansion or a flat or whatever it's called. Let's say an apartment building in here in America, these homes in these taller buildings are called apartments. But in England they call it a flat. So that's because of the different locations. They use different words in the different locations, America versus Great Britain. Now, if you don't know about it, you might think, ooh, an apartment, and here I see flat. So what is the difference between apartment and a flat? Maybe you start to develop a whole theory that really it's not the same because there's different words, so they must mean something different. But if you just know that this is the usage of the language, then the problem is solved, right? So it's very important to understand the language of the in the Bible, let's say the prophet or the sage or the wise person or the king or whoever is responsible for the words that are written there. So we have one thing within even biblical Hebrew, within the Hebrew Bible, we have older texts and later texts. The next one, we have texts from different regional dialects. I already mentioned North and South, for instance, but also others. I'm going to look at it a bit closer. We have different styles. For instance, you have, if you write poetry, like a poem, that would be different than writing, as you have, let's say, in the book Bamidbar Sinai, there you have, let's say, lists of counts of people and tribes and with the names of the heads of the tribes. That's a different style than, for instance, poetry. We have people, the prophets or the writers, from different social status. All right, I kind of mentioned that this is a nice repeat, and so, but there is the older language versus later language. The language changed. For instance, let's say you have here Nabi, it's a prophet, and Ro'eh, which literally means a seer. And there is proof in the Bible itself that that the words have changed over time. Because what do we see here in the book in book 1 Samuel 9, verse 9? There it says, previously in Israel, a person would say when he went to inquire of God, when you want to ask God something, you go to a prophet and you say, oh, this prophet, he knows how to communicate with God. He has insight. Let me ask a question to the prophet. He would say, come on, let's go to the seer, to the ro'eh. Because the person known as a prophet today, this is when the text was written, was formerly called a seer. So you see here already in the Bible itself that now we call somebody a navi, but before we called them a ro'eh. Now we call him a prophet, then we used to call him a seer. It's the same thing, it's just a different term. So this is an indication in the Bible itself. This author of 1 Samuel says, he says, language changes and Hebrew has changed, even in the time of the Bible. Okay, now, for instance, another example, you have two words for I, Anoki and Ani. Ani is used more often, and Anoki less. Now, Anoki seems to be an older form, but prophets sometimes use older language, even when it's less, less used. So some prophets use a lot of Anoki. A lot of prophets use more Ani. And in modern Hebrew, Anoki is really not said. It's now Ani only. But this seems to be could also be a difference in style. I'm not sure if it's more formal Anoki or versus Ani. But as I have read opinions that this is due to older versus later language. Now let's look at a map. So you see the different regional dialects. Look at the blue here. The blue is the kingdom of Israel, and the south here in the middle is called kingdom of Judah. So the people of Israel, when you said in those days the people of Israel, you thought of the people of the north, of the kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Judah, that's where the name Jews comes from, because Judaism is actually descendant of this kingdom. This kind of disappeared mostly. So it's known that people in the north use different vocabulary, different words, sometimes than people in the south. And also people are within the kingdom of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. So here is the River Jordan, um, also had their own dialect. And you see that the kingdom of Israel is closer to here, the kingdom of Aram. There's different Arams, but there's Aram of Damascus, and here have other Aramean tribes, and the Assyrians also used Aramaic, but Aram is they spoke Aramaic, and so there seems to be a little more influence of Aramaic on the north, but that's not the only thing. In any case, it's a complicated matter. But there are differences, as you see here in language between north and south. Go to the next slide. North and south. All right. I already said that. Wasn't so necessary. Okay. Examples here. For instance, there is the word gerem for bone. The bones are in my arms, for instance. And there's also the word asem. So asem or netsem, whatever how you pronounce it. We'll talk about pronunciation later. One of the explanations for the different terms is not that it means something else. I'm sure that later commentators have come up with explanations that point out difference of meaning because they weren't aware that this was a dialectic difference. But modern scholars believe that gerem was a term mostly used in the north and aetsem in the south, asem or aetsem or netsem in the south. Another example, asher, which means which is, or the one who, asher kiddushan mitzvotav, the one who sanctified us through his commandments, asher. Now, she is shorter. There are modern scholars believe that she originated more in the north. And by the way, as a general rule of thumb, the north made a lot of words shorter than the south. So if you have two words that are practically the same, but one is shorter, then in many cases the shorter form comes from the north, which is interesting to know. I'll give you. We do not know for sure. I mean, it's hard to prove, but it may be that there's two words for the mountain of God: Sinai, right? Mount Sinai, Sinai in Hebrew, but there's not the word Horev, like in English Horeb. So there are theories that Horev is really the northern word and Sinai the southern word. Now you might say, well, both appear in the Torah, but it's possible that to be inclusive, even if Moses wrote the whole Torah, he could want to be inclusive of both dialects, so that the different tribes would all understand it. Who knows? You can fantasize on that, but I'm just saying there are people who seriously say that Horev is a northern word for the mountain of God, and Sinai the southern word. There's another one. Elijah, the prophet Elijah, his full name is Eliyahu, and there's a shorter word, Eliah. Now, this is another example, maybe, how in the north, some of these words were shortened. So Eliyahu, shorter form. Eliah supposedly was the northern form. And you have that with many cases. And then you have Uziyahu and Uzziah. You have two forms, and the shorter one is possibly, people believe, the northern form. Yehoshua, that's Joshua, but Yeshua should be a northern form of Yehoshua. It's definitely shorter. And specifically these letters, the H, Yehoshua, and Yeshua, that kind of letters are typically fall off in the north. And even in the time of the Talmud, by the way, I'm just digressing a bit, but there are reports that people from the north, especially from the very north, the Galilee, that they weren't, you couldn't hear the difference between one word or the other, and we'll get to that another time. Now, there's also another one. There was somebody called Nahum the Galilean, which means he is from the Galilee. And He lived in Alkosh. We don't know where it is. Is that Babylonia, or is that Capharnaum, which is on the border of this lake here, the Lake of Galilee? Not sure, but he did. It seems clear that for a while he also lived in Babylonia. But for instance, there's a word Netzer or Natsar, and he pronounces it as Natar, which is exactly what happens also in Aramaic. So this seems to be an Aramaic influence. And you see, as I wrote down here, the Galilee is very close to Aram, so it's not wouldn't be so strange. Okay, I showed you some things. Now, social status. So Amos, I already mentioned, was a shepherd, and so I'll give some examples how things are different in his lingo, in his words. The word metzik or mesik, which is pressed down, he in Amos it occurs as me'ik, also something that could happen in Aramaic. Uh, Muta'ev is there, muta'ev, so the ayin becomes an aleph, something, a confusing thing that was rare in those days. It's very common now in modern Hebrew, that the ayin and the aleph are confused, but that also happens in Aramaic a lot. And here's interesting, Isaac is in Hebrew Yishak, and he writes it as Yishak with a sin, although the sin and the shin weren't really distinguished yet in his days. That's much later, but it seems most likely was have been a sin, Yishak. And drowned, Nishka'a is Nishka. So the ayin, Nishka'a, Nishka. So Nishka'a, Nishka. He hardly probably pronounced the ayin. Maybe Amos was the first modern Hebrew speaker. I'm kidding, but it's some ways similar to modern Hebrew. The mistakes that he makes, so to say. Okay, we continue. So there are different styles also. We have stories, we have poetry, we have laws. Like legal language is different from poetry or from stories, right? We have speeches. A speech also is different. And we have wisdom teachings. Those are different kinds of writings in the Hebrew Bible that all have their own, how do you say, their own style. Okay, there's also prophecy. So when a prophet says, "Thus speaks the Lord, I shall smite your enemies," for instance, that's a prophecy. A prophecy has a different style, and an admonition is, "Woe unto you, if you do not repent, I will send the plague." And an admonition is maybe similar to a prophecy, but you could say possibly different altogether. We're approaching the end of the second class. Still, the differences of style within the Bible are not huge. So if you know biblical Hebrew, you have some general biblical Hebrew. You will have maybe some problems with certain unusual texts. Let's say you know the language of the Torah, which is pretty straightforward in many cases. If you go to prophets are cryptic, meaning they're puzzling. They are sometimes have unusual words. They have double meanings and things like that. So there are sometimes words that we don't really know what it means because they're only used once or twice, but we don't really know. That happens. But in general, if you know the general biblical Hebrew, you can basically understand a lot of the Bible, and to be honest, also of the prayers, which is a later style of Hebrew. So about 1,000 years ago, the scribes have added signs to fix the pronunciation. Those are the vowels. We're going to talk about that in one of our coming classes. They also applied the same rules for all the texts. So even though there were different dialects, perhaps, with different pronunciations, maybe one person said Rosh, and maybe somebody else said Rash, and maybe somebody else says Rush, or they put the same vowels, the same pronunciation signs on every case of that word, so the differences are kind of disappeared if there were anyone, right? So that makes sense. So it makes it simpler. So as a result, different parts of the Hebrew Bible now look more alike than they probably did originally, right? So because of and 1,000 years ago is very late. Of course, we can also speculate that the pronunciation may have changed over the times before the sounds were written down. It's very hard to reconstruct, to know how Hebrew was initially pronounced. I go to our last slide, ladies and gentlemen, and then you just have to wait till the next one comes available, and I'll do my best. All right, sometimes when there are unusual forms or forms that became unusual, the scribes gave instructions how to pronounce the word differently. There's sometimes you have for you is ata for a man and at for a woman, but you have also forms that have ati. It will just say this here, ati without the vowels. Ati, it actually has an e at the end, but because the vowels, the little dots in and beneath the word, direct us to that, not say ati, but at. Right? So there are different forms. Ati might have been an older form, but it became not used. And so the vowels much later have been put it, the signs have been put in and underneath the letters so that we don't say ati anymore, but at. Also, sometimes there is who, that is he, and the word he means she. It's confusing, right? He means she. But in any case, the Hebrew word he means she, and who means he. But sometimes you would have, look at the very bottom, you would have, it actually says who, but it's written, but it is about a woman. So there might have been a period in time where the form for a man, as we call he, right? The form for a man could be used for both a man and a woman. So you could say who for a man or a woman, but he only for a woman. So you see many times that actually the letters itself say who instead of he. But then the scribes have written the vowels in a way that you see you're not supposed to say who for because it's a woman. You say he instead of who. So because it became weird to say he for a woman, like you say she. We have other forms like that also. Na'ar, young man, was also used for young woman. And later they wrote a sign that you have that says na'ar, but you have to say na'ara because that is young woman, right? Nowadays or later. In any case, hope this was not too confusing, that last little piece. But we're going to get to that again. This is only the introduction. And what I mean with this last point is that the signs in and underneath and sometimes above the letters have made it more regular, have made the language of the Bible that has differences more the same. So it is still a great thing to study biblical Hebrew. What I wanted to say in this class is that you have different types of Hebrew: biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic or rabbinic Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, and modern Hebrew, to the four most important division groups. And I described how even biblical Hebrew is not as straightforward. But next time I'm going to compare biblical Hebrew with later forms of Hebrew. So that's the promise, and you can look forward to that. If this was complicated, just listen to it again. So it's handy stuff. You can absolutely learn Hebrew without knowing this. But is it preferable? No, it's very useful to understand what's going on, and why certain things are irregular and why there are different words. And so I encourage you to try to understand this at least. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again on our next episode of Biblical Hebrew. Thanks for your attention and have a wonderful day. Bye bye.